the original topic, the title that I gave, which was about 2-3 weeks ago, was the Mayans, Incas, and the Aztecs of the Americas. My interest in this was really all of a sudden, because I think it was in 1999, I was invited to give a talk at the University of Mexico in Mexico City. At that time, my host, who was one of my former PhD students, decided he knew of my interest, so he took me around and he took me to an Aztec site, which is just about 20 minutes away from downtown Mexico City. And I was amazed at what I saw. And being a person interested in history, that really got me going. And of course, I had subsequently visited Mexico a couple of times and then to Peru. And so this information I'm going to share with you is really partly learned out of those travels, if you will. But most of the pictures that I'm going to show you are really from museums and other sites, because some of these sites that I have on my list, I haven't visited yet, but I've read about them quite extensively. And I have a slide on things that you may consider reading if you're interested in this. The first picture is really on the left-hand side, is stuff that was created 3,000 years ago. Now, very important part of this presentation is for you to first give you an idea of Mesoamerican culture, their civilization, and then get into the main topic of hybrid beings. Because I think many of you may not be familiar with how rich these civilizations were, although they were quite different, very different from what we know in India or from the Middle East. So let me get going. The very first one is, this is what I woke up to this morning. You're at 25 degrees centigrade, I'm at -6 degrees centigrade. Nevertheless, that is my coffee chair at the backyard. That's where I usually would have my coffee in the morning, but naturally I could not do that today. But that got me going at my desk for preparing my presentation. Okay, the key outline of my talk, the way I'm going to be organizing it is to give you a quick timeline of Mesoamerican civilization, timeline, approximate times. Remember that the bulk of the work in this area has really evolved in the last 50 or 70 years. And most of the inscriptions were really read after the Second World War, substantially in the last 30 years. So there is still new information coming. And I'll speak a little bit about that a little bit later. And then I'm going to give you initially a quick photo tour of 4 or 5 sites to give you a flavor for the kind of space that we are looking at. And then look at cultural residues of Mesoamerica. I'd initially included the Incas. We will not have time, so I have canceled that out. That may have to be wait for another day. And then the gods and religions of Mayans, because they are the prominent people. They were voluminous in their writings and inscriptions. And although about 80% of them have been read, only there are still stuff to be read anyway, that is yet left. And the Mayan language is not a single language. There are about 30 languages. So there are variations regionally. Some of the more ancient Mayan languages are yet to be transcribed, if you will, somewhat like the Indus seals. And then in the second half, or the last third of the talk, will be on hybrid beings of Mesoamerica. And I'll point out some of the commonality of how folks in this part of the world thought about gods in the way they perceived it. And maybe I'll make a remark or two about how folks in India did, and others may pitch in and talk about how it was and elsewhere. Then I'll summarize my talk in a few bullet points, and then raise a few questions for you to investigate or for me to investigate, simply to instigate, because one of the point of such talks is really bring up new questions for us to examine or perhaps shoot them down. I would call them in my field hypotheses, but let me get to that after I get through the talk. I better watch my time. I tend to be long-winded. It's 37, I'm 7 minutes into my talk. So what are you going to get out of this? You're going to get an idea of the civilization of Mesoamerica, its cultural features, and how they perceive God, and what types of hybrid beings. I will not be doing a comprehensive one. I will take a few examples, but it's really a voluminous, because they got lots and lots of gods, just like we have. Does anybody here know how many gods we have in India? it's almost limitless, right? You can go into a little village, there will be a god there. That god will not be in any of the books, but that will be the god for the local people. They have a similar feature in this particular part of the world too. Okay, background. India was populated by humans 70,000 years ago. So India has a very, very long history. Also, the humankind evolved about 240,000 years ago, but India's part of it is 70,000. And India was in constant contact with a lot of other cultures. So what you see in India is really a combination of many different cultures, particularly strongly influenced from the Northwest, because that is a major path of migration into India. And what this map is a map of Y haplogroup. This is the way you can identify one person's descendancy, if you will. And in India, we have very ancient haplogroups such as C with a mutant 130 that was discovered near Madurai by Professor Pichayappan and the professor from Stanford University. So that goes back to 70,000 or so years. And of course, we have much more recent ones of haplogroup R as well. So it's very large. On the other hand, the entire Americas substantially is haplogroup Q. And they are the same people as the people who are coming from Alaska. Eskimos have the same haplogroup. There were some debates as to whether it was populated by a C. That was not the case. And the folks, the Homo sapiens arrived in this continent only 10,000 years ago. So 70,000, 10,000. So they had a much shorter human history. So until then, all kinds of things were growing there, animals and plants, obviously. The other interesting thing is they did not have an Iron Age. On the other hand, India did almost 3,000 years ago. And they did not use wheels for transportation. I'll elaborate on that. So brief timeline. The first hunters-gatherers arrived in the continent about 11,000 years ago. There's some debate about 20,000 or 10,000, but the most compelling evidence suggests 11,000 years ago. Corn cultivation, bean, squash, chili peppers, and cotton. These were the first domesticated plants that were cultivated for the civilization. We have evidence of corn here from 5,300 years ago, which lacked the gene that is present in today's plants that we grow for food. And therefore, the evolution of corn really took place in the little red region that I show in this map here. Mesoamerica is a piece of America that is between North America and South America. Meso simply means middle. The mother civilization here are the Olmecs. They seem to have emerged around 2000 BCE into settlements. So there were cities that are about 4,000 years old in this part of the world. Those excavations are still going on. And that civilization sort of petered out around 500 BCE. And then we see the giving rise to multiple other civilizations, chief among them being Mayan civilization, which is towards the eastern part, the Yucatan Peninsula. You might be able to see my arrow, right? You can see my arrow. So this is the Yucatan Peninsula. All those things that are spotted with red are actually Mayan cities. And some of them go back to pre-Christian era. Most of them died by about 800 or 900 CE. Few survived a little bit farther, but then the Spanish came around 1500, pretty much that destroyed the Mayan civilization. But those folks still continue with certain religious practices. I have seen them in villages, but they're substantially have been converted into Christianity. And I'll make some remarks. Few takeaway points. First, when you eat a maize or a corn, that was domesticated here. And the reason why you're able to eat it in India is because somebody brought those seeds from this part of the world. Second, tomato was domesticated in this part of the world. And the fact that you had tomato in your sambar is because of the Mayans and the Incas, people in the Andes region. Potato was domesticated in the Peru region. And when you eat puri with potato bhaji, that's because of people in this part of the world. And I visited a museum in Lima, in Peru, which had 2,230 varieties of potatoes, some of them as big as watermelon, some of them as tiny as beans. And there's an enormous variety. The Incas experimented with various different potatoes. And the one that you have is the very highly domesticated version, which came to India via Europe. Chili, when you eat red chili, that was due to the Aztec. And the word chili itself is an Aztec language word, chili. So when you speak chili, you're talking a language from this part of the world. And interestingly, chili comes into India in 1848. A British guy cultivated it not too far from Chennai. And the Indian taste buds were first introduced to red pepper only in the middle part of 19th century. And now, can you imagine Indian cuisine without red chili? And of course, Mayans, Aztecs actually contributed to the Indian flavor, if you will. Now, when you eat a chocolate, it comes from an Aztec language. And the Mayans, they have, as part of the ritual, chocolate. It's a bitter drink. It is not like the sweet, the one that we have. It's an extract of cocoa beans that grows in this part of the world. And the word chocolate actually comes from the word that I've written there. X is pronounced like the retroflexive ja is in Tamil or Malayalam. Shakalatil will be the way that will be pronounced. I'm not doing it accurately at the moment, but the word chocolate comes from an Aztec word, if you will. The language, by the way, is known as Nahuatl, not Aztec language. Aztec language is sort of for people such as us to refer to it. Okay. I'm going to, next phase is really to give you a very quick tour of some major sites. And we'll start with La Venta, which is sort of the mother place where Olmec civilization started about 3,000 years ago, where they had little cities. So this is where La Venta is in this region over here, which is to the east of, this is typically known as the as a Veracruz region. And this clay pyramid is still unexcavated. There are steps that go on the far side, and there are apparently rituals that were conducted here because there were some residues that have been dug up. Within a few kilometers from here, there is a very large city by those time standard, approximately 1 kilometer by about 0.75 kilometers, and with a plaza with columns. And the excavation of that started not too long ago. And as of 2 years ago, they have excavated only 2% of that entire area. And that has been dated to be 1200 BC. That's approximately the same as the time as the Indus Valley civilization, at least the one that I have read. Some have Indus Valley civilization goes back many thousand years earlier than that. Okay, this is where everything started, if you will, in Mesoamerica, and this spread out east, south, west, etc. Aztec on the west. For example, you're now looking at an Aztec site. The city name is Teotihuacan, which is about half an hour drive from Mexico City. Mexico City is a huge metropolis, about the size of Bombay. I think it's probably about half the size in terms of population. And it's within a very short distance. Even within Mexico City, they have found Aztec temples underground, if you will, when they were digging up for subways. So the pyramids you see here, there are 3 major pyramids, one for the sun, one for the moon, and one for, I don't remember for what. And this city goes back to 400 BCE, and it sort of died around 750 CE. And then another culture started back up, known as Toltec, which is like the Mayans, related to Mayans, but they came from the northwest, if you will. And they thrived for about 200 years, and then they died off, if you will, followed by Zaptel, various other different cultures, if you will. The 2 main gods at this site, because I've gone up the top of this particular pyramid, are the so-called spider goddess and the vegetation goddess, which we'll see quite a bit of, Quetzalcoatl, whose interpretation changes with culture, because you see that going back almost 1,500 years. But of course, we have Mayan sculptures of that going back just about 800 years. And so but its meaning and attributes change with time, as we see that in Mayan books, if you will, scriptures. And of course, the rain god, Tlaloc, if you will. The second location we're going to go to is El Tahin, which is in the northern part, northeast of Mexico City. The reason why I picked this up is because it's a rather unique pyramid. This is the only one that has niches. That's why it's in Spanish, it's known as Pirámide de los Nichos. So it's got, all others do not have niches such as this. So it's sort of unique in that sense. And it started around 300 to 1200 when it died off, if you will. Many of these settlements died off. We do not know the exact reason. People believe it is due to drought or some agricultural phenomena that caused this demise of these cultures. But the zenith was about 600 CE. We go to a very rich place, Copan, which is in Honduras, which is in the southern part of that Mesoamerica. Going back to 400 to 800 CE, those were the peak period. But recent excavation indicate they go back several hundred years before Common Era. And they have dug through apparently they have this habit of building pyramids on top of pyramids. So they don't destroy what is already there. So when you see a pyramid here, that's actually underneath that, there is a more ancient pyramid or ancient structure. And that discovery has led to people excavating underneath in some clever means without destroying what is on top. This place has enormous amount of slab inscriptions, and they have a huge list of kings who ruled this area. I have that list there. And each one, some of them have a face associated with that panel, some of them do not. And they have descriptions of who killed whom. Interestingly, I have just given a highlight of one guy on the left. I won't even try to pronounce his name. So that is a king that I've highlighted in this panel who ruled between 695 CE to 738 CE, almost about 45 years. And there are many of them at this particular site. It's a very large site. It is not a small one, as I seem to indicate here. There's a little model that I've shown on the left bottom corner. Next, we go to Palenque, which is in the Chiapas, in the sort of east of La Venta, but of course, far west of the Yucatan Peninsula. Here, this was another extremely rich in inscriptions. The lineage is given here. And among this goes back to 226 BC to 800 CE. And there are kings identified going back much earlier than this. And scholars believe those are mythological figures, not real figures. The person who's been labeled as Casper is really a nickname given because the inscription is not easily readable, but they were able to read 252 BCE. So this site has been active for over 2,200 years and a settlement, city settlement. And of course, there's a lineage starting with 431 CE all the way up to 800 CE. And then of course it dies, just like how Indus Valley died. This seemed to have died in a similar fashion. And of course, people then distributed themselves into the peninsula. Then finally, we come to the most popular spot. If you ever go to Mexico, every tourist literature will have a picture of Chichen Itza, which is a late Mayan site, 600 to 1200 CE. And it's got enormous amount of architecture, huge columns known as the Temple of Soldiers, if you will, it is called. And on the left bottom corner, this is where a priest would be doing his religious ceremonies. And this is really the altar from Mayan perspective. And of course, this, of course, is simply an idol that is representative of the god receiving it. And here is the jaguar throne. This is where the king or the chieftain would sit, if you will. Unlike the empires in other parts of the world, here most of the cities were self-contained governance. So a city was in itself a state. They used to fight with each other. They killed each other. But the city was a self-governing entity, if you will. So it had a small elite, a lot of peasants, mostly farmers, if you will. And of course, there were soldiers to protect the city, if you will. So They didn't build huge, large empires. They built only cities. Okay. I'm 20 minutes into my talk and I'm hardly halfway through. Okay, what is different and same about civilizations of the Americas? There was no Iron Age phase. India's Iron Age phase goes through the second millennium BCE. Bronze Age came much later, 1000 BCE to 500 CE. India's Bronze Age goes back 3200 BCE. Gold, silver, and copper were available in plenty, but they didn't think about gold as being very precious. They wanted jade. Jade was considered far more precious, or stone, which was available in the mountains. And they made their precious things out of jade, not out of gold. But the Incas, on the other hand, made their gold, the gods and jewelry out of gold. That is in South America. They invented the zero, approximately 100 BC. There are inscriptions that point in that direction. And their discovery was independent of what happened in India, if you will. Dates included in several inscriptions, and they were very, very careful about their accounts, if you will, numbers. They were really masters of numbers. City-states, I mentioned this, they knew about wheels, but they did not use them for transportation, but they did use in toys, if you will. There was no potter's wheel discovered so far at any of the excavation sites, but they made beautiful pottery. The number system is based on 20. Use just 3 symbols. I'll show this to you. While we in the decimal system use 10, and of course, therefore it's a little bit more complicated from a scientific perspective. They kept accurate calendars. That dates were absolute. For example, an inscription, Chola inscription would read 16th regal year of this particular king. And of course, you'll have to know when that guy came up to the throne, right? On the other hand, they use absolute. Their numbers were precisely the same year. They didn't refer to their dates were not relative, they were absolute. And I'll point out why they did that. They had a pantheon of gods, hundreds of gods, but mostly about 10, 15. And this is very similar in the Indian context. Bloodletting was an important ritual to the gods. And the bloodletting was not of animals, but of people. And the human sacrifice was not uncommon. And the person who is to be sacrificed must be of royal descent, not ordinary people. So this is very different. So a king would sacrifice his son or daughter to achieve certain things. So it's very interesting. And king himself would offer his own blood, and a king would offer blood from his penis, and a woman would offer blood from her tongue. And I have some pictures of this. So these are rituals that are common in this part of the world. Maya religion concept. Here, this is where mythology comes about. Plumed serpent, namely winged serpent from the sky, and the hurricane from the sea got together to create the world. And there's a whole series of stories that are in Mayan books, creation books that were discovered at Merida, which is in the Yucatan Peninsula. And that is in Germany, in the museum. No, that is not in Germany. I think that's in Paris. But anyway, that has been transcribed by several scholars. They believed in recurring cycle of creation and destruction. And for Mayans, an era lasts 5,200 modern years. And current era began 3,113 BCE. And of course, that ended in 2012. And we are in the next era, according to their calendar. And they have lots of mythological stories of creation and evolution, about kings fighting with each other, and kings' sons and daughters, and etc. And so there is some similarity in that. And it's interesting to think about how this mythological stories and how mythological stories that are present in the Indian context occurred independent of each other. So this must have something to do with the imagination of the people, right? It's a property of the human species. This is simply to illustrate how even now a Mayan lady is making a pot here on the left-hand side, but excavation release from 8th century gave these toys with wheels, but they didn't think about wheels being large and then use that as a cart. They didn't go to that step, but they did have wheeled toys with carts, if you will. Now, with respect to numbers, I'm going to go through a little bit quickly. The numbers start with 0, represented by a shell. 1 was a dot, 2 was 2 dots, etc. And all the way up to 19. A bar becomes 5. And this is actually from a Mayan holy book. And now, for dates, they would use 5 digits separated, and they were written from top to bottom. And we used day, month, and year, but they used day, month, year, and 20 years and 400 years. And it'll, for example, this particular inscription going back to, I think, 100 BC, 100 BC, has this particular date and an inscription next to it. This is the date and an inscription. This was found in a field. A farmer picked it up and found initially this, and the second piece came much later, and the two was assembled together by a scholar in Texas. It's 7.16.6.16.18, which turns out to be September the 3rd, the year 32 BC by our time. So whenever there is a king's ascendancy is included, the date is given in the absolute number. The absolute number is, if you go back and figure this out based on this, and that'll be starting from when the era started, if you will. So there is no the ascendancy year, but it is always an absolute year. And very interesting. And of course, we have common era before and common era after, if you will. And the reference point is 0. Here, the reference point is the starting point of the era. So they kept very accurate calendars, if you will. I'm running out of time. Mayan written records. And these are just examples. And there are, these are made out of tree barks. And they are very long, about 20 feet long, 10 to 20 feet long, highly decorated. Many of them are over 600-700 years old. I do not know whether there were much older ones discovered. I do not know the exact dates of some of them. And here is a good example of one that was one inscription, which I'm not going to go into the details, except that to note that the detail that they included, this describes the ascendancy of one particular king and when he was born and who the king, his previous king was. And all of that was captured in this 7 pictograms, if you will. And let me go. There are inscriptions that have been discovered from Olmec period, from 400 BC, which haven't been deciphered as yet. People believe this particular inscription belongs to 1000 BC, but they haven't been interpreted yet. And so there are still most of the Olmec inscriptions are not yet figured out as yet. Now, let me come to the main topic of the discussion, hybrid being. Okay. In the context of these folks, the Olmecs or the Mayans or all related cultures, the serpent, the winged serpent, for example, here is a serpent with a wing. These are sort of stylistic wing, was considered the god that created the world, right, with the hurricane. And therefore, whenever that symbol is there, there is a holiness associated with this. This is an Olmec panel. It is believed that this is a ruler who attains a god status because the winged serpent is crouching over him, if you will. This is in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, by the way. Let me go to the next one. Sorry, I'm running a little bit. I'm going to take just 5 more minutes. Olmec hybrid being. Cougar, namely cougar, the version that most of you are familiar with, are known to be a ferocious animal. They were perhaps present in huge amounts. So that was considered, had a holy status in their minds. So hybrid beings were created with human features with a cougar face. And this particular one goes back to the Olmec period, if you will. And here are jade. So these were smaller items. The previous one was a larger statue. And I've included a cougar, jaguar. It's a cougar. I mistyped it as jaguar, I think. Maybe I made a mistake. But even a cougar is the one that was considered holy. These are pictures that have been excavated from funeral sites. And then here is one corn god. you'll notice that this is a holiness because it has the features of feline features, presumably the cougar feature, holding a corn plant with a corn ear in front of it. And here is another 1,000 years later from a Mayan site. And here is a seated cougar, 600 BCE versus a jade cougar. Here is the cougar face, and here is a human individual behind it. This is part of a funeral site, if you believe. And here is an avian, a bird with a human. This was considered a relic of a ruler, if you will. A ruler kept this as his sort of a good luck charm, is what the scholarship says. And this belongs to between 10th century BCE to 6th century BCE. Here is another example of a cougar mouth with a human features. And Olmec maze dating, here is, it has cougar features on the face and with a corn on top. And this has been located at Guerrero location. And feathered serpent was another holy symbol because that contributed to creation. And I have a great deal of explanation here. And here is one panel where this lady, Waktun, one of the queens, offering her blood using from her tongue as part of the ritual. And here is a priest who is monitoring this process. This took place in 709 CE. It's in a Mayan site. And there's a whole slew of gods, if you will, with certain attributes. The only one I like to point out is Shak, who's the god of rain, and Ahakin, who is the sun god, who has got all kinds of features. He also exhibits himself as present in their panels as jaguar-like features. And final, my conclusion, last slide. I'm about 5 minutes over. Mesoamerican civilization, I gave you a little bit of an idea of their writing art and stone architecture, framing, and cultural practices. Although its farming and cities were formative in early first millennium BCE, by 5th century CE, they had extensive temples, large temples, great deal of rich architecture and literature as well. Mayans also invented hybrid beings very similar to other cultures of the world. And the question that I want to pose for you is whether the visual representation came first or the text and beliefs and faith came first, or what made those visual representation in the way they came. The other way to look about it is God, the deity, is a power. It's a center of power and therefore strength, which may induce in an individual fear or respect or love, which then transcends into a visual representation, which is what we see as statues, if you will. How we would test these hypotheses is something that I'll open it up for people to examine, and I will be examining them myself in different cultures, not only with the Mayan culture. I'll stop there. I'm 6 minutes over.
No problem, sir. Thank you very much for your excellent, very informative and comprehensive presentation. We enjoyed very much. Now the paper is open for discussion. Are there any questions?
No questions.
This is Shankar Babu. Sir, an excellent presentation. Even though the initial thing was a little out of context, you set the context very well on a similar and well-developed society, how it is brought into this one. And finally, the climax, the images and iconography were mind-blowing, totally different set, totally different perspective. And your final slide on which came first is a very good poster. This is something which we need to discuss in detail, and we may also have a separate conversation or a presentation series on that. Excellent day. Thank you, sir.
The comment I'll make with respect to that comment is, yesterday, I think Kumdar, whom I had met about some 15 years ago in Bombay, made the remark about how the way Shiva was presented in Manasa and then to Mandal changed within about 100 years. with just a humanoid figure to one with 4 arms and etc. And I
Yeah.
wonder whether in between some scholar wrote something about Shiva and say he had 4 arms, and therefore the sculptors were made to put four arms. So that'll be a good one to examine, if you will. So that thought cropped in my mind, because this idea, when you think about this, these guys were fearful of the cougar, and so they made them into fear means strength, right? And also means fear is the feeling you get when you look at power and strength. So it's a protective response. And so when you want to represent that strength, you would use what will create fear in you. But when you look at lingam, no fear comes, right? When you look at Shiva with 8 hands, any fear comes? No. But I think there's also an artistic component, and artists have also been creative. So this is a question to be discussed at some point in time. I'll leave it to Professor Preeta Nair. The idea of how do you reduce an idea into a picture form so an average person can visualize it? And that transformation or that translation, how does that take place in the ancient context, in the more modern context? Because now I've seen pictures of Ganapati playing cricket. I think you showed this, right?
Yeah.
Now that is very time contextual. And suddenly Ganapati realizes he knows how to play cricket, right? So
no, he is doing COVID related hospital services also.
Right. So the way we present visual version of God, so God, in my opinion, is an abstract concept, is really based upon the human experience. It's the resultant of the human experience and how that takes place in the form. But now, so the scholars think about it in particular way. The artists and the sculptors are another creative entity. They think about issues very differently. And these two are not dependent on each other. They're actually independent thought processes. But yet, when you create a statue, that is the result of the stapadi, right? It is the artist who creates that. It's not the scholar, most often. Anyway, I'll leave that as an open question to think about it.
What you said is very correct, sir. Which came first is a very intriguing question, and we have to probe into it. Thank you very much for the very excellent presentation.